Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video where we're going to be discussing Rachel's piece on if there are absolute moral rules. We're going to use this reading to introduce a different approach to ethical theory than we discussed last week and in our last video. While our previous approach to morality we referred to broadly as either utilitarian or consequentialist approaches to morality, for this week we're going to introduce an alternative perspective, one that is broadly known as deontological versions of morality, right? So the utilitarian system is going to be focused especially on producing good consequences, as we analyzed in the past, and the deontological approach, by contrast, is going to be concerned first and foremost with the rules or the reasoning that informs your action. So they're going to generally focus more on intention rather than the consequences. And in order to introduce this idea, I would like us to begin by considering two difficult cases for moral theory, and especially moral theory about the nature of moral responsibility. I want us to consider two cases. First, a case where you attempt to do good, but you end up actually hurting others. In another case where you try to do something horrible and inadvertently end up producing some good consequences. The Rachel's piece tries to demonstrate this by using the example of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. However, I feel that this example is to some degree unduly complex and controversial and likely to introduce a lot of empirical aspects to our reasoning. And by that I mean, instead of talking about the nature of moral theory, we're very likely to instead discuss what, the best strategic situation was during World War II, etc., 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 right? So even though the Rachel's piece focuses on that case, I want us to focus on even simpler, even less complex, even less controversial cases. So in terms of this case that I've labeled A, situations where you're trying to do good, but you end up in effect producing negative consequences. Think about, for example, someone who sees a child who, maybe dropped their toy or something like that, right, as they're crossing a busy street. They're in the way of oncoming traffic, right? And a good Samaritan onlooker sees the situation and jumps out to help the kid, right? Save the kid from oncoming traffic. Well, we can imagine that the Good Samaritan, despite himself, ends up producing like an accident, right? Maybe there's a huge crash and a huge pileup of cars and so on, because this Good Samaritan went out of their way in order to try to save this child's life. In this case, we are, I think, justifiably frustrated by consequentialist or utilitarian approaches to the question of moral responsibility. Why so? Well, because from the utilitarian or consequentialist point of view, and this is something that's actually brought up by the Schaefer-Landau piece that we read last week, we would have to hold in this case that the Good Samaritan is morally responsible for producing the car crash, for producing, the negative consequences to a larger group of people. And so to that effect, the utilitarian or the consequentialist has to look at the actions of the Good Samaritan as akin to evil actions. Maybe the utilitarian can develop an argument that says, hey, maybe we shouldn't hold this person legally responsible. But according to their theory of morality, it seems that the utilitarian or the consequentialist must hold the Good Samaritan, in this case, to be morally responsible for the consequences that they produced. Now, for some people think that this is, fine consequence of the utilitarian approach to morality, but other people would see this situation and want to say something like, look, it was just an accident, right? It was an accident of the circumstances that the Good Samaritan's intentions were not realized in saving lives and instead happened to produce a situation where people suffered and died. But that doesn't speak to the moral character of the Good Samaritan. In other words, you might want to say, in that situation, even though the Good Samaritan's actions produced bad consequences, that the Good Samaritan's actions are in fact good, and that we are justified in referring to this person as a Good Samaritan. Think conversely, about the alternative situation. Someone who attempts to do bad, but perhaps by chance or accident produces good consequences. I think that the simplest and most uncontroversial cases for us to imagine in these cases are cases of coercive medical experimentation. This is something that is true about the history of modern medicine is that it benefited enormously from unethical medical experiments on unwilling participants. So, for example, many of us know that many medical advances were made by Nazi scientists, and part of the way that they were able to arrive at the medical discoveries that they arrived at is specifically by violating the rights of their patients, right? And so it seems to produce this problem because the utilitarian wants to say, of course, coerced medical experimentation is wrong, but it seems like what they should say is, well, in the end, someone was severely harmed and damaged, but on the whole, it produced good consequences. And therefore, it seems like the utilitarian or the consequentialist is forced to endorse the troubling aspects of medical history that's characteristic both of Nazi Germany, but also in the United States, coercive medical experimentation, especially on slave women. So you have these problems, right? Problems where what's going on is their actions seem out of step in terms of our moral evaluations with the consequences that they end up producing. Now, of course, the utilitarian or the consequentialist has something to say about this, and these cases were brought up in the Schaefer-Landau piece for a reason. Now, generally, there are two ways that the utilitarian can approach this dilemma. The first is to just bite the bullet, right? And what do I mean by bite the bullet? I mean that the utilitarian will simply accept the unintuitive consequences in these cases. So it turns out that the Good Samaritan is bad, and the evil medical scientist is good, right? When you take a long-term perspective on things. But for many people, that's a very, very difficult idea to accept, right? We believe that the Good Samaritan is worthy of a positive moral evaluation and that the coercive medical experiments deserve a negative moral evaluation. So the first solution on the part of the utilitarians is just to say, hey, maybe our intuitions are wrong. Maybe we just need to realize that these are problematic cases for our theory and accept the consequence. But another approach that the utilitarians can give is they can say, hey, look, moral responsibility attaches not to the actual consequences of the events that take place, but instead to the expected consequences. So, for example, in this case, the Good Samaritan expects to save a life, even if they don't actually do so. And similarly, the immoral doctor, right, expects to violate the dignity, etc., privacy, and so on, rights of their medical patients. And so if the utilitarian approach isn't about the actual consequences that you produce, that's not what moral responsibility attaches to, but instead moral responsibility attaches to what you can reasonably expect to be the consequences of your actions, then perhaps we have some better resources for dealing with these questions about moral responsibility. However, as Schaefer-Landau notes, this route of making a distinction between actual and expected utility is very unpopular with utilitarians. Why is it very unpopular with utilitarians? Well, because it produces the consequence that sometimes actions that genuinely do improve the sum total state of humanity actually end up being immoral, or that we should have a negative moral evaluation. We should view the person who's responsible for them as morally wrong. And most utilitarians think, well, if you think that, you might just be distancing yourself from the real heart and soul of the utilitarian moral theory, which is not based on the things that we expect to happen, but instead is based on what actually happens. So you might think from this debate that there are no really happy or straightforward ways for the utilitarian or the consequentialist to deal with these troubling cases about the nature of moral responsibility. And we'll use this problem to introduce our new alternative approach that, at least theoretically, is going to resolve this question better. And that is what I've been calling deontology. And according to this moral theory, it's intentions and not the consequences of actions that are the primary interest of morality. So in other words, morality is about principles. It's not actually about, what ends up occurring, because the consequences of any given action are at least partially happenstance. It's luck, right? And it doesn't seem like when we say that someone is morally a good person, right, that we think that that's just based on luck and circumstance. We think, at least according to the deontological approach, it's because they take the right sorts of things to be considerations for action. Now, we have to develop this idea because it is far less intuitive than is the consequentialist approach. And so the main representative of the deontological approach, hence sometimes the deontological approach is just called Kantianism, is this guy, Immanuel Kant. He is a German philosopher. We're going to be reading a significant amount of his work this semester. And he is the first person to really systematize this approach towards morality. Of course, he's not totally an innovator. Kant thought that actually most common sense ordinary people agreed with his moral system, even if they didn't, philosophically reconstruct it or draw out all of its consequences. And so Kant thought he was just being a good philosopher and coming along and organizing and systematizing ideas that we already have. Hence, the Rachels, for example, cites St. Paul. And there are a lot of religious, especially Judeo-Christian, origins of this theory of morality that says you should always do the right thing, consequences be damned, right? And now we need to do a little work to define what it is that we mean when we say do the right thing. So Kant's position is characterized by the fact that morality So what we're doing, moral theory, assessment of right and wrong, is about the principle or maxim motivating action. So in this case, rather than paying attention to like what the Good Samaritan or the bad doctor, what consequences they end up producing, we instead, according to the deontological approach, should look at the principles that motivate their behavior. So the Good Samaritan's principle is to save as many vulnerable lives as possible, and that's something that we can give moral approval of. Similarly, the bad doctor, the bad doctor's principle or maxim underlying their action is that the rights of their medical patients don't matter for the purposes of producing, expanded medical knowledge or something like that. And Kant says, no matter what you discover, even if you found a cure for cancer or something like that, we cannot approve of that as a moral assessment of their behavior. So Kant thinks that he can give an answer for why the Good Samaritan is good in spite of the consequences, and why the bad doctor is bad in spite of the consequences. The Rachel's piece introduces this important distinction in Kant between categorical and hypothetical imperatives. Categorical just means like always, all of the time. And hypothetical means it's conditioned on something. So for example, if I want to be an Olympian, I should eat lots of vegetables. But I might not want to be an Olympian, right? In this case, the advice that you give me, hey, if you want to be an Olympian, eat a lot of vegetables, it doesn't have any binding or normative force, right? There's nothing that makes me want to go eat a bunch of vegetables because you said that, assuming I don't want to compete in the Olympics. By the contrary, in contrast, categorical imperatives are imperatives that hold all the time, regardless of the agent's desires, circumstances, etc. These are moral rules that for Kant always hold, and even regardless of the circumstances. So Kant thinks, for example, do not murder, do not lie, help others. These are examples of categorical imperatives. Kant doesn't think it makes sense to say something like, if you want to be moral, don't kill someone, because Kant thinks we rightfully assume everyone wants to be moral, right? And why do we assume that? Well, because we assume everyone wants to be rational, right? So when we make a moral criticism of someone, we're also therefore stating that they are somehow acting irrationally, that they're failing to heed rationality. So Kant thought that the reason why these moral rules always apply is because they're related to our nature as rational creatures. Because we are always rational creatures, and insofar as we're engaged in moral decision making, we're engaged in a rational enterprise, then these rules can always hold. Now, while that characterizes what Kant means by the categorical imperative, which is just the same thing as morality or the moral law or something like that, we still haven't yet characterized, well, okay, so there are moral rules and they're absolute and they are based on nothing other than the structure of reason. But what are those rules? And Kant here provides different formulations of the categorical imperative that he thinks produces the same results, right? So you can use either formulation, Kant thinks, and it will always produce the same agreed upon set of things that are permissible, things that are obligatory, etc. Right? So we get a whole system of morality, according to Kant, simply based on these rules, these ideas. And we're going to talk about two formulations today. The first being what I call what is often referred to as the formula of universal law, or formulation of universal law, and the formula of humanity, right? So these are going to be, for Kant, the same thing. And I've paraphrased the formulation here. Kant says something like, quote, "I ought only to act in such a way that the maxim of my action should become a universal law of nature." If you think about it, what Kant is saying here is very, very similar to what you might already be familiar with as the golden rule. Treat other people how you would like to be treated. I think one way of rephrasing this for Kant would be, a reason for me is a reason for thee, right? So what is the idea here? Well, Kant's thought is that if you look at morality, right, you look at any moral action, then it's enough to decide if it's moral if we just imagine the inconsistency if everyone acted that way, right? So some of Kant's examples would be lying to a creditor, right? So I have some rich friend and I want money, and so I take out a loan with my rich friend and I'm like, hey, screw this guy. Like, I don't, I'm not going to pay him back. I'm just going to never be in contact with this guy again, right? What does Kant have to say about that? Well, what Kant says is immoral about, for example, taking on a huge loan and then never paying it back is that it makes the whole enterprise of giving and asking for loans nonsense, right? If it was totally public, if it was a universal law of nature, like, hey, I'm always going to cheat my creditors when it's to my self-interest, then the whole institution of credit and lending would not exist. That's Kant's thought, right? And so you can think similarly with, like, lying, for example. If the principle behind human communication was just like, well, I'll lie if it's to my benefit, and everyone will lie if it's to their benefit, then the whole system of giving and asking for reasons and obligations and morality, according to Kant, collapses. So Kant thinks that you can never lie, no matter what, regardless of the circumstances, because lying as an act is practically irrational. It violates the formula of universal law. Similarly, the formula of humanity states that I ought to treat others as an end in itself and not merely as a means. I had two mirrors here. Merely as a mirror. So I ought to treat others as an end in themselves and not merely as a means, right? So what does this mean? Well, it means that when I'm looking at other rational creatures, right, other human beings, I have to recognize them as a source of value. So they're not just like stuff in the world, right? Instead, they have their own intrinsic human worth, something that Kant calls dignity. Kant contrasts the idea of dignity with price. So when I use someone as a mere means, I'm acting like their value is a certain price. So everyone has this idea that, or, everyone's probably heard the thought, the idea that everyone has a price, right? That you would do something immoral, even to people that you deeply care about, if you were given enough money, right? If you are given the positive thing that you want, right? So in other words, everyone has a price. But what Kant says to the contrary is that all rational beings had to be treated with dignity. So in other words, there's no price, there's no consequence big enough to ever justify violating the dignity and the freedom of another rational being. So just as the formula for universal law can give me a reason for why I shouldn't, lie to my creditors and so on, so also the formula of humanity can explain what's wrong with that action, which is that I'm treating my friend as a mere means, right? As a way for me to climb the social ladder and get all the money that I want or whatever else, right? And not as a fellow rational creature worthy of dignity and respect. So Kant thinks that there are absolute moral rules that you always have to follow regardless of the circumstances, because we realize that the principles motivating the action are in fact rational. This is the core of the Kantian or deontological approach to morality. We're going to continue to explore these ideas in more depth over the course of this semester, but I hope that you found this video interesting, and I'm very much looking forward to what you all have to say in the discussion forum. I'll see you next time. Bye.